On a cold Sunday morning in the autumn of 1957, three trainee soldiers were walking through the Suffolk countryside when they approached the village of Kersey. Taking a moment, they surveyed their surroundings, and the three soldiers realized that something seemed off. William Lang, one of the men there that morning, would later recall that as they entered the village, the season itself seemed to change. The colors faded and were replaced by the fresh greens of spring. Ahead of them, the church tower stood on the hill, its bell ringing clearly. But as they drew closer, roughly 100 yards or so, the church disappeared abruptly. And what followed was an unnatural silence. No birds, no wind, and no distinct movement of life. The houses around where the village once stood seemed ancient and stripped of anything modern. There were no street lamps anymore. There were no wires, no aerials, nothing that anchored the scene to the 20th century. When they approached the stream, the ducks floated motionless in the water. Lang would later say that they almost looked lifeless, like they were decoys. Peering through narrow windows of the cottages, the soldiers saw no sign of occupancy, except for what appeared to be a butcher shop, where inside hung 3 skinned ox carcasses, green with age and thick with cobwebs. As though whoever had been there had abandoned mid-work. When the men got to the small bridge, that's when the atmosphere shifted. What felt quiet and almost sad became something much darker. They described a sudden, overwhelming sensation of being watched, as if they were no longer alone, despite the empty streets. After about 20 minutes of being in the village, fear took over the men, and they ran back in the direction that they had walked. And as suddenly as it had vanished, their world returned. The church that had disappeared stood in its place, bells ringing loudly. Smoke rose from the chimney that had been long empty moments before. Later comparisons with modern photographs raised an unsettling question. The church should have never disappeared from view at all. Some believe that it suggested that they may not have slipped merely in time, but had walked into a different world altogether. One before the church had even been built. Some stories blur the line between reality and the unfamiliar. They whisper in the night, waiting to be heard. So let's listen. Let's talk spooky. Welcome back, my spooky souls. I am so excited for this episode. I love anything to do with glitches in the Matrix and time slips and going back in time. I wanted to cover this episode last year, but I just needed more time to gather information and make sure that I gave it justice. So here we are with our time slip episode. And even better, next week, we're going to do Reddit stories. So it'll be a collection of just time slip Reddit stories. So if you love this episode, you're going to love next week's because it is creepy. I went down the Reddit hole and I should not go down Reddit at like midnight. If you are new here, welcome to Let's Talk Spooky. Here we explore the eerie, the mysterious, and the stories that refuse to fade from folklore and forgotten history. And we dabble in true crime a little bit. If that's your vibe, hit that follow button and join us every Thursday for a brand new spooky episode. Tonight, we are going to get lost in time to old beliefs that put traveling down narrow paths as a place where you might want to proceed with caution. So light a candle, get cozy, and let's talk spooky. We tend to imagine time as something solid, a straight line that we move along, the moment we're born to the moment we die, one moment neatly falling into the next. But every so often, people describe an experience that doesn't quite fit that idea, where time doesn't stop or break, it simply changes or shifts. A time slip isn't necessarily time travel. There's no machines, there's no intention, there's no control, there's no living within the space. Although I'm sure it won't stop any of us from placing our hands on the standing stones anytime we're lucky enough to visit Scotland. I don't know, or maybe that's just me. But those who experience time slips rarely say they went anywhere, essentially. Instead, they described the unsettling feeling that the world around them changed, while they remained the same. Familiar places became slightly unfamiliar. Ordinary landscapes seemed to be stripped of the essentials: noise, movement, life itself. Even landmarks are gone. And the moment feels thin, as though reality itself has kind of lost a layer. And what makes time slips essentially strange is how unremarkable they often begin. A walk through the woods, or down a narrow path that you had taken 100 times before, a drive, a shortcut home. There's no warning, no dramatic signal, no lights and bursting sounds. It just happens. A quiet sense of things suddenly going out of step. Many people struggle to explain what they felt in that moment. It's not always fear, at least not at first. More often it's a disorientation, a creeping unawareness that something changed, that something is wrong, and the inability to pinpoint exactly what that wrong is. Where the world looks real, but it's not right. Time slips are rarely pleasant either. They aren't a thrilling adventure. They're often described as sad, empty, and unsettling, a place where it seems to have been lost or abandoned. Even though the experience lasts maybe only minutes, it leaves a lasting impression on the person who experienced it, one that people seem to carry with them for years after. And when the moment ends, it's usually very abrupt. The sound suddenly returns, the movement resumes, the world kind of clicks back into place as though nothing had happened at all. Except the person standing there is now aware that time, whatever it truly is not as stable as we want to believe. In the stories that I'm going to share, I want you to not look for proof. I want you to look at the patterns, or the small repeating details that suggest the experiences aren't an isolated oddity, that they're a part of a much quieter and much older mystery. Because long before anyone spoke of time slips, people already were telling stories about places where time behaved different. In Celtic folklore, these moments were said to occur in thin places, areas where the world had worn down for centuries of use, belief, and memory. Time in these places didn't really move forward as expected. They almost pooled or overlapped. Past and present seemed to exist side by side. For brief moments, they even interacted. Ferry roads were among the most feared in these places. Often invisible, these ancient paths were believed to cut through the hills, fields, and villages, and to step on one was to risk slipping out of the human world altogether. Stories tell of travelers who walked for what felt like minutes, only to return home to find it had been hours or years later. Others returned unchanged while everyone else had aged and become unrecognizable. And this, too, is where much of the wildling and changeling lore really branched from, which I am excited to visit in a future episode with you guys. But these patterns or ideas of thin places are not limited to just Ireland and Scotland. In parts of Wales, there are tales of people entering valleys or villages that appear completely intact but are empty. And the air there becomes unnaturally still. The sound is muted, as if swallowed. In Scandinavian folklore, certain forests are said to hold travelers, almost disorienting them until time itself seems to stretch thin. The person might wander in circles for hours, even days, yet swear they had just arrived. We actually covered haunted forests in an episode earlier, which I'll link in the description box below. So if you haven't checked that out, we do touch on this holding of its hikers and stuff captive. But across rural France, older legends speak of Lost Hamlet, which is a place that glimpses at dusk or dawn that vanishes when you approach it, almost like a mirage. In Germany, stories of between time areas are described as moments where people step off a road and find themselves walking through a landscape that feels familiar but off. What unites these stories is not the unsettling, but the sensation. The standing, walking through time, but not necessarily being a part of it. And that's where the difference between time slips and time travel really take hold. Some firsthand documentation that we located in our research spoke of a common experience that seemed to be a reoccurring one in most of the stories that we found. First, silence comes. And not like the quiet, peaceful silence that you experience when you're just meditating, but a heavy absence of all sound. No birds, no insects, no wind. Almost like a vacuum effect. Then comes the sense of absence. No people, no movement, no signs of life ongoing. Fires are cold, tools are left where they had fallen, food is untouched, as if the moment never arrived. People, if they appear at all, are usually wrong. Their faces lack expression or are blurred. Some movement is repeated or seeming delayed. In some cases, witnesses report seeing no one at all. Villages without inhabitants. Homes feel abandoned despite showing signs of recent use. Architecture often becomes the clue in this. Buildings tend to look older or appear older, and they're stripped of anything modern. There are no wires, no vehicles, no signs of contemporary life at all. Doors may stand open, and the world may appear kind of flat, or too bright, or washed in a funny hue. Seasons sometimes might be incorrect. Spring, where it should be autumn. Greenery, where decay is expected. Witnesses notice this only after the fact, though. It's not something that stands out right away. It's usually once the sense of unease has already taken hold. And that's when there's the feeling. Nearly every account mentioned a growing sensation of being watched. Not seen in a physical sense, but noticed. As though the place itself has become aware of an intruder. And what begins as curiosity or confusion soon shifts to dread and fear, and an unmistakable understanding that the person does not belong there. Time within these experiences is difficult to judge. Some accounts have lasted minutes and others feel much longer. Many realize that something is wrong as soon as they step in, and others as soon as they leave. Then only to discover missing hours, altered surroundings, and changes that they can't explain. Then the return is almost as sudden. The sound suddenly rushes back, the movement resumes, the smoke rises, and everything as it was before. People appear again, the world kind of snaps back into place. And it makes those who experience this question their own perception. Did they see what they just saw? Or was it all in their head? And finally, there's something that folklore describes carefully as a sense of sorrow that seems to surround the individual for a little while after they've experienced this. What a lot of these tales, especially in old folklore, do warn against is any lingering. So, this meaning that if experiencing something like this, you should never sit down, you should never eat, you should never fall asleep. Folklore believes that these acts will anchor the person to another time, making it extremely difficult for them to return. By the 18th and 19th century, stories like this began to appear not just in folklore either, but in letters, journals, parish records, and local reports. And they were rarely labeled as supernatural, surprisingly. Instead, they were described as a reluctant disturbance in an otherwise ordinary day, which, in my opinion, seems supernatural to me, but that's just me. One common account, though, is usually given by rural travelers. So these are people who go from countryside to countryside. And most of them talk of an individual leaving at dusk, traveling a path they had walked countless times before, when partway along they come across something unnatural, where the air around them fades, the sound fades, and everything looks wrong. And then fear kicks in. And as they leave and return home, they find that they've been gone for hours, sometimes even days, when they swore they had only been minutes. There are also accounts involving towns rather than fields, where travelers entered small villages expecting shelter and food, and instead found streets empty of people, shops appearing to be stocked but unattended, and in some cases, witnesses described encountering a single occupied space, like a baker or blacksmith or butcher, only the scene felt wrong. Everything around them decayed, and the individual looked unnatural. And just as always, fear would set in, and often they would run in the direction that they had come, and everything would return just as it was. What stands out in these early reports is the restraint of what is said. There is no language of wonder or fantasy, but instead it's a tone of caution, even apologetic. Writers often emphasize that their sobriety, their family was in the area, and they were reluctant to draw conclusions about what had happened. Many record experiences only because they couldn't account for the lost time and they needed to make sense of it. But just as we spoke before, all of the same markers occur: silence, stillness, absence, a creeping awareness of intrusion, and a sudden return to reality. So these cases suggest that whatever people know or call as a time slip was already happening long before modern explanation, and modern distractions existed. Experience didn't change, only the language that was used to explain it. So now let's wander into the 20th century, because these accounts become much more detailed, much more confident, and much more unsettling. We start to see accounts from soldiers, surveyors, drivers, people who observe their surroundings carefully, people who are accustomed to structure, schedules, clearly defined reality. And yet, these individuals describe moments of time that speak the same type of language as the people who did before them. Once again, the setting is familiar. The roads are those that we've traveled. And yet, something is wrong. And this raises the question, why do time slips occur further out of towns and cities generally? And part of the answer may lie in what rural spaces preserve: old path, ancient boundaries, landscapes that have been changed slowly rather than rebuilt over. In the countryside, layers of time are not erased, but stacked upon. Roads follow earlier roads, fields overlap former settlements, churches rise somewhere where older ones stood before them. If time slips, it seems that it does so where the past isn't fully buried. One of the most frequent cited modern cases takes place in the English village of Kersey. And we talked about this at the beginning, where 3 trained soldiers were walking through the countryside on a clear autumn morning, and suddenly everything changed. What makes this case so disturbing is how strange it was and how familiar it felt. Like the ones that came before them, rural settings continue to dominate the accounts of time slips, not because cities are immune to them, because they're not. We are going to read some pretty creepy Reddit stories about people who had time slips within a city, but because the countryside seems to remember a time before cities took over. It holds its shape a little better. It holds the old routes, the old rules, and if time loses its footing there, it seems to happen in a place that's closest to where the old and the new almost coexist. In the next stories, the location changes a bit, but the pattern doesn't. As modern life spread outwards and setting of time slips shift within it, countryside is still present, but now the encounters are at speed. From behind a windshield, along footpaths and trails, or as modern life spreads outwards, the setting of time shifts, it also changes a little bit. We still see it more predominantly in countrysides, but now we encounter it at a speed because now we have vehicles. We're visiting different times behind a windshield on roads that were meant to move people forward, not backward. Drivers report some of the clearest modern accounts: a familiar stretch of road ahead, empty when it shouldn't be, no cars, no houses, no lights, the radio cuts to static or complete silence. Distance begins to feel distorted, and it seems like it's taking too long to get where they need to be. The town signs appear, but the town itself doesn't fit. It doesn't fit what we see on a regular basis. Fear begins to rise quickly in these accounts because it's often that the driver realizes that something is wrong much faster, because maybe it's a route that they've done hundreds of times before. But then, without warning, the road corrects itself. Suddenly traffic appears and radios resume, and drivers themselves almost feel disoriented because the last thing they remember was minutes ago. But when they look at their clock on the dash, hours have passed. And I have 2 stories for you guys that show just how creepy driving and losing your way can be. On a clear afternoon in the late 1990s, Dave drove through a rural stretch of countryside that he knew very well. It was an indirect route that he had taken a dozen times before, but the road narrowed as it cut between 2 hedgerows. The radio began to crackle, and the local news suddenly disappeared. There was no obvious turn or junction, but he could tell something was off, that the landscape had changed. As he drove through the hedges, they seemed to fall away, and the road opened up to a small village. It was orderly, but old-fashioned looking. Stone cottages stood close together, windows were uncurtained and the doors were closed. A church sat far at the end of the road, its bell tower dark against the sky. And as he slowed his car, Dave felt confused. because he drove this road before and there was no village ever. He was certain that there were people in the homes, but as he drove slowly, he realized that the shapes of people were there, but they weren't moving, and there was something off about them. A woman stood at her doorway, almost frozen in mid-step. A man leaned against a fence, one arm rose, like he was caught in the act of waving. But nothing happened. The silence was so consuming. There was no birds, no wind, even the sound of his car engine was muted. A sense of pressure began to build in his chest, not necessarily fear at first, but almost a warning, a primal instinct that was telling him to get out of here. And he decided not to stop his car because something inside him told him, don't do that. So as he passed through the village, he did notice some details that unsettled him. More than just the stillness, but there seemed to be tools left on the road. Carts broken, laundry hanging stiff in the wind. Everything looked abandoned, but there were people. How could that be? It was as if time had paused, and he had walked into that moment. The moment cleared at the last building, and the world seemed to snap back. The hedges returned around him, the road widened, the volume surged on his car, and he nearly startled himself off the road. Traffic appeared ahead, and nobody seemed to notice the moment around him. When he pulled over to steady himself, he checked the clock, and nearly 2 hours had passed. Later, he returned to the area, and this time he looked a little closer. He looked on maps, on satellite images, and there was no sign of a village, no church, no trace that anything had been there. But he decided, just in case, to take the long way around next time. Our next story is of a solo hiker who entered the forest shortly after noon and realized very quickly that he was not in the right place. Casey had entered the woods at about noon, and he expected to be back to his car well before the evening took place. But about an hour in the woods, everything seemed to change. It wasn't drastic or sudden darkness or strange sounds or a growing absence. It just was different. The trail led him to a clearing that he had never been before, and the trees on the edge stood close together. They seemed to crowd the space around him unnaturally. The clearing felt almost as it was compressed, and the forest seemed more aware. He checked his watch, and only minutes had passed since he last left his car, and he felt the overwhelming urge to sit a bit, to be quiet. But he didn't know why. He wasn't exhausted, he wasn't tired, he had just started walking, but something deep inside him wanted to sit. That sitting would be comfortable, it would be settling. And that thought woke something in him that terrified him. Without fully understanding why, he became certain that stopping would be a terrible mistake. And he didn't check his map, he didn't look for landmarks, he simply ran. And he ran as fast as he could, back in the direction that he had just come. And the silence seemed to follow him until abruptly it didn't. All the sound rushed back at once, the wind through the leaves, the birds. His own breath was heavy in his ears. And as he reached the trailhead that he had just passed minutes before, the sun was low in the sky. It was dusk. When he reached his car, he realized that 6 hours had passed. He had entered the forest shortly after noon, and it was nearly 6:30 p.m. He later described the experience as not getting lost, but as if something in the forest tried to convince him to stay. When we revisit older folklore, we see the pattern of warnings. Warnings against lingering, against sitting, against eating and sleeping. And modern accounts seem to echo the same rules. Don't stop, don't settle, and whatever you do, don't stay too long. And perhaps that fear has shaped an awareness. Somewhere deep inside, we know to leave. When we enter some of these fragile parts of time, it's easy to feel comfortable. But it's important to never stay. Now, there's many ways to explain time slips in a more psychological format. Psychology offers language such as disorientation, memory gaps, altered perception. Physics gives us metaphors, nonlinear time, overlapping frames, unstable systems. But folklore speaks of warnings, of boundaries that were never meant to be passed, and places that we should never linger for too long. Yet, none of these explanations really seem to fully account for the consistency of this happening. People who have never met one another, people who don't share the same books, beliefs, still echo the same details in their stories. So, if these were fully intentional experiences, then why are they so similar? Why are they repeated so frequently? So perhaps what we take away is that time is not a straight line, but a surface, one that occasionally ripples under pressure. And perhaps places carry more than just history. Perhaps human perception sometimes slips into the rhythm of the world around it. Or perhaps these moments sit at the edge of an understanding because they're not meant to be understood. What matters is not whether time slips can be measured or proven, but that they are real to those who have experienced them. And they change how people move through the world afterward. They make them cautious, observant, aware of familiarity. That doesn't guarantee safety. Time slips don't announce themselves. They don't have some kind of buzz or bright lights. And they offer no answers after. And they leave you profoundly confused. So as you move through your days now that you've heard all this, be aware that sometimes roads don't lead where they should, and that familiar places don't always remain anchored in time. And that if you have a time slip, don't stay too long, and never, ever, ever sit down. Well, thank you for stepping through time with me tonight, and I hope you enjoyed hearing some of the creepy aspects of time slips. Next week, we're going to dive into Reddit forum, and we're going to read some stories that you guys posted. And I'm excited. I picked some good ones, and I think you're going to love them. If you have your own experience with time and you want to share that with me, please do, because I want to hear it. I love all your creepy stories. I get so excited to read them. So send them my way through email at letstalkspookypodcast@gmail.com or check out our socials at Let's Talk Spooky Pod. If you haven't hit that follow button or subscribe button yet, please do. It helps our show grow, and it also sends you alerts whenever I post a new episode. And I might post a random one in the next couple of weeks. So stay tuned for that. See you guys next time. And as always, stay curious and stay spooky. This episode was written and produced by me, Shauna, and the team here at Let's Talk Spooky. All sources can be found in the show notes. Follow us on our socials at Let's Talk Spooky Pod on TikTok and Let's Talk Spooky on Instagram.